Good evening, everyone. Welcome to DPF's event on discussion on the proposed amendments to IAS Cadre rules. On January 12th, the Department of Personnel and Training (DOPT), in a letter to Chief Secretaries of all state governments, set out a proposal for amendments in the IAS Cadre rules 1954, saying that an officer from the Union government wishes to put on deputation would stand relieved from his or her respective cadre, irrespective of the concerns state governments concerned within the stipulated time. It also states that even if the officers are not interested, he or she could be automatically allotted to the union cadre. See, the problem is not the states not willing to share officers with the state government. The problem is much more than that. Even if you take Tamil Nadu, some of the finest officers and TN cadres have gone on to do wonders in the union government. Be it Narayan was supposed to speak today, who served as Union Finance Secretary and also the advisor to the Prime Minister. Also be it Punlingam Sir, IAS, who is here, who worked in the Cabinet Secretariat. The problem is it is seen as an attempt to coerce or nudge officers not following the intentions of the union government to come and serve as the union government. That's the problem. Do you know what happened with senior officials in West Bengal? The profound example for the same is the former Chief Secretary of West Bengal, Alappan, IAS. He was forced, he was summoned, and also to an extent threatened. So the clear issue is not states not willing to share offices with the union government. It's much more a structural one. As Honorable Finance Minister P.T.R. Sir in a recent interview said, the main issue is the shortage of officers recruited. We have more than 500,000 people writing the exam, but we select only, for example, 50 or 60. In fact, if you see from late 80s and the 90s, number of officers being selected has reduced significantly. On the contrary, the demands of civil service has drastically increased, not just in India, but across the world. Recently, there was an article in The Economist on how civil service in the UK increased 25% because of COVID and also after 2008 financial crisis, where demands of the governments have increased drastically. And again, similarly, there was never too many officers wanting to go to union government to work as a director or as an undersecretary because of the demands of the work or the poor working conditions. So what the government should have done is, this government isn't passed since 2014. They could have done is to improve the condition or make it more coercive or conducive. In fact, another concern is, as a political scientist in the University of Oxford, he has already published some papers on how the present government is using chief secretaries and through chief secretaries is trying to influence district magistrates and collectors and subvert the elected state governments. So this concern is already there. And based on this, even Christophe Geoffroy has written a couple of editorials. I'm not sure if it was published in English newspapers, but it was there in French, where he says, for the first time since independence, the present government is directly trying to get in contact with DMs, district magistrates and collectors. So, for example, let's say there are only 4 people eligible to be appointed as chief secretaries and state government wants 1 person. It's possible that the union government can immediately force him or her to join the union government. And what will happen if someone is forced? He's not going to do a good work, because if someone does not want to go to Delhi, then why will he show interest in working for the union government? And again, policy implementation happens at the state level. So TN and most of the southern states are really good in many socio-economic metrics because of the policy implementation. And what happens at union level is mostly policy making, not implementation. So this again kind of depriving states that do well of good officers and harming states for their good work. So what will eventually happen is, this will also move the states from IAS, and they will also be forced to recruit state officers in major propositions. And the eventual loss would be the country, India itself, because if states do not individually perform really well, then the country suffers. So with this, I would like to introduce our panel. The first to speak would be Dr. P.T.R.Palanivel Rajan, founder DPF and Hon'ble Minister for Finance and Human Resource Management. He was previously Managing Director of Standard Chartered Bank Global Markets. And next would be Jawar Sircar, Hon'ble MP, representing Trinamool Congress at the Rajya Sabha. He was a 1975 Indian Administrative Service officer, and he was a secretary to Government of India, where he headed Ministry of Culture. Where he was the longest serving secretary. And next would be Dr. P.V. Ramesh. He's a doctor from CVC Vellore, and he's 1985 batch of IAS officer, principal secretary to different departments of AP, and he was also a special secretary to the present Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, Jagan Mohan Reddy. And next would be Purnalingam. He was a former health secretary to the government of Tamil Nadu, and he also served in the union cabinet as additional secretary, and he was also union secretary to Ministry of Textiles. With this, I introduce the Honorable Minister to speak.
Thank you very much, Dravidian. Thank you for my fellow panelists for coming and taking the time. It's a privilege to be among such distinguished panelists and to have this opportunity. As you know, maybe I just say a word about the Dravidian Professionals Forum. We set this up a few years ago because we wanted to reinvigorate the intellectual component of the Dravidian political movement and to return to the core ideas and ideology and find a platform to debate them and to look at a century later new interpretations and new manifestations in policy of an ideology that has stayed constant for a century. That itself is a big achievement. As you know, very few political or socio-political movements persist for that length of time. But coming back to the topic of hand, I think Dharani has encapsulated some of the basic issues. I was on some TV station, I forget which one recently, and I said we have a crime problem as a finance minister and as a personnel administrative reforms portfolio holder as well, which we now call human resource management. Overall, the nature of government is, relative to my experience as a banker, first an investment banker in the US and then a commercial global banker in emerging markets, the system is profoundly under, what can I say, designed and under-resourced. We have very little continuity, we have very little real-time information. Files move by paper still, we're on the way to making them electronic. Institutional memory doesn't exist, officers come and go, records are sparse. I sat for 5 years as an opposition MLA and looked at CAG reports as part of the Public Accounts Committee. They're 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 8 years late, and nothing gets done about it. So we have created a system where, you know, the classic notions of organizational design, of infrastructure, of institutional memory, of institutional learning, of institutional growth, of accountability, of alignment of incentives, all of these basically are either decaying or decayed. And therefore, it's not surprising, in my opinion, beyond corruption or beyond the morality of politics, there's a structural weakness in the system in terms of what the job requires and what the system provides. In that sense, this is a particularly inopportune time to be having this kind of unnecessary fight about who gets to dictate what. As I also said in the interview, beyond any considerations of state versus union or party A versus party B, we are still a democracy, and it's very contrary to the notions of a democracy that any officer can be forced to do anything against their will. Now, one could argue that transfers internally within the state are to some extent not with the consent of particular officers. But you know, that's what officers sign up for. When you sign up for the cadre of a state, you expect to be rotated within that state. And both in terms of climate or complexity of your life, or you know, the ability to keep your family still in your old place and go to the new place and come back and go. It's not that hard to get internal postings and transfers within a state. Of course, a whole different ballgame were you to get suddenly called up to Delhi one day. So in that sense, I would go so far as to say that both because of the timing of this move and because of the bad history, the instance on West Bengal cited earlier by Dravidian, I think that this is a very, you know, unfortunate development with the wrong motivations. Because if really the union government was worried about the number of officers, why did they not scale up the pipeline over the last 7 years of sitting in office? To be fair, the previous governments didn't do so either. So I'm not blaming them only. But surely it didn't dawn on them all of a sudden one day that there's a shortage of officers. They could have done something about it over the last 7 years. The second point I'd like to make that is this is the same government that said they were going to go gung-ho for lateral entry to make up for administrative kind of shortfall. And they've done it to some extent, not so much as they promised. But if lateral entry is a solution, and if you have not bothered to expand the pipeline, then really you have no moral standing to now come and demand that people come whenever you say so. So were I to put on my kind of politician's hat, I would say this is a case of really bad intent. The intent to have kind of megalomaniacal control of everything, of the whole country, which is it's not even ownable, it is not executable. Just because you accumulate power does not mean you can actually get results, right? So this kind of a system would not only result in too much concentration of power in one hand or two hands, it would disrupt the functioning of state governments, where office bearers would worry that any day if they did too good a job, they could get pulled. And effectively, it would create, in my understanding, though I'm not an officer myself, just looking at it from outside, an environment of fear and uncertainty, which would greatly debilitate morale and performance on a daily basis. What's really surprising to me is why this has become a BJP versus not BJP state issue. I mean, it's ludicrous that this should have anything to do with politics. This is clearly against the principles of democracy, against the principle of freedom of labor, who wants to work at what, at when. It's clearly against federalism, it's against states' rights. Every way, it's against that. So why is it that BJP states don't see that? I mean, if it's not as if we are all the same political alignment. It's not as if we are all in the same, kind of political coalition. And yet we understand the implications of this. How is it that the UPs and the Bihars and the, Gujarats, even for that matter, how come they don't see it? How come they don't understand it? Or have they sacrificed the interests of administration and state and the people of their state at the altar of the great leader? And therefore they say, yes, sir, 3 bags full to whatever is proposed. In fact, I'll go one step further on that. I can guarantee you, and I would request anybody to challenge me, that were the current Prime Minister, the Chief Minister of Gujarat, he would have absolutely blown a fuse. He would have thrown a complete fit if such a document had been sent to the state of Gujarat from the union government, even if it had been an NDA government in Delhi, let alone if it had been a UPA government. So, if I say in conclusion, one kind of negative problem and one kind of call to action. This is the kind of ongoing accumulation of power without accountability, without answerability, without even results. It is debilitating for a country to see so much power being accumulated in 1 or 2 hands. And the consequences of, to people's lives are miserable and have been evident for several years. Joblessness, lack of growth, lack of progress, in some cases through bad policies like demonetization, starvation, lack of education, so forth. So this is another worrying kind of event in an otherwise very destabilizing and anti-democratic movement. On the positive side, what I would say is that this is a wake-up call, at least as far as Tamil Nadu is concerned. I have been saying for some time now as the portfolio minister that our recruitment system and our staffing system is fundamentally broken. Forget about the UPSC and the IAS officers. I'm talking about the government of Tamil Nadu, its subsidiaries, its PSUs, its corporations and municipalities and its universities and entities. And the whole model of government staffing and recruitment is profoundly disjointed. Right now, we have something about a 35 or 38% vacancy rate in the number of allotted seats in government, which is a bit of a joke. So the allotment really means nothing. Neither could we afford to pay all of them if we appointed them, nor is it clear there's that much work to be done. So, the one aspect of the decay of administration overall is this lack of proper recruiting, proper staffing, proper evaluation and promotion procedures. We have the seniority system where the rank you got on the TNPSC, let's say 30 years ago, determines where you are in the promotion roster. It's ludicrous, it's ridiculous. No other entity in the world, no other corporation, no other kind of market force subject entity will allow that. Even most governments will have some component for performance and other variables in the course of your career rather than your score on an exam 30 years back. So in that sense, we have already started doing a lot of reform in Tamil Nadu. And I think these kinds of events being forced on us by otherwise not so friendly government will just be an accelerant. And if I may say, just as one last thing, more as a kind of in a note of sadness rather than as a political point. This notion that somehow a decision can be made in Delhi and then propagated to 1.4 billion people without discussion, without any input, without any worry that 10 minds and 5 debates might have yielded a better outcome than one random stroke by one person on one day. This notion that somehow there is this God complex, that somebody is all-knowing, all-seeing, and all-powerful, and if they say so, it should happen. This notion is the really worrying notion for me, and this is another facet of that notion. So with that, maybe let me stop and thank all the other panelists again, and then just mute myself and go off screen. And I look forward very much to hearing the other panelists who have lived this life. I'm just looking at it from the outside. So it'll be much more enlightening to hear from people who've been there and done that. Thank you.
So thank you so much for your time and for your amazing speech.